My husband looked at me across a table I had set with my own hands, and he said the words that ended my marriage before I even understood what was happening. It's time to tell the truth. His sister slid an envelope toward me, and I watched my mother-in-law rise from her chair like a judge preparing to deliver a sentence. Pack your things, she said. You don't belong in this family anymore. My son slid under the table, hiding from people he had called family his whole life. Then the doorbell rang. Nobody moved to answer it, and I still didn't know what was inside that envelope. I want to go back 6 hours, because I need you to understand how a Tuesday dinner became the night my whole life cracked open. My name is Joanna Franklin. I'm 43 years old, a charge nurse at a hospital in Springfield, Illinois. I have spent 17 years married to a man named Mitchell Franklin. Mitchell owns a small construction company, the kind that survives on referrals and handshake deals. And for most of our marriage, I have been the steady income when his business wasn't. I never minded. That's what you do when you love someone. You carry what needs carrying and you don't keep score. We have a son, Ethan. He's 8. He has Mitchell's stubborn chin and my habit of asking questions before he's ready to hear the answers. He is without exaggeration the center of everything I've built. That Tuesday started like any other. I'd worked a double the night before, came home at 7 in the morning, slept 4 hours and was back at the hospital by 2 for a shift. I'd picked up to cover payroll for Mitchell's crew. His company was going through a rough patch again, and I didn't ask questions about it anymore. I just filled the gaps. That's who I'd been for 17 years. My phone rang around 4:30, Mitchell. Mom wants everyone there early tonight, he said. Something in his voice made me stop mid-step in the hallway outside the break room. It wasn't the words. It was the flatness underneath them, like he was reading off a script someone else had written. Everything okay? I asked. Yeah, just come straight from work, bring Ethan. He hung up before I could ask anything else. I stood there for a second, staring at the phone, telling myself it was nothing. Linda, my mother-in-law, was always summoning people for one thing or another. A birthday, a church fundraiser, some new complaint about the neighbors. I told myself this was just Tuesday. But some part of me, the part that has spent 2 decades reading vital signs and knowing when something underneath a calm face is wrong, didn't believe it. Linda's house sits at the end of a cul-de-sac in a neighborhood that hasn't changed in 30 years. The same brick ranch houses, the same maple trees dropping the same leaves every October. I've been walking through that front door for 17 years, and I know the creak of the 3rd porch step, the smell of her lemon polish on the banister, the exact place the screen door sticks in humid weather. That evening, none of it felt familiar. The porch light was on, but the house felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with the thermostat. Rachel's car was already in the driveway, parked at an angle, like she'd pulled in fast. Mitchell's truck sat behind it. I remember thinking everyone's already here and feeling my stomach tighten before I even had a reason. Inside, the table was set for 5, plates and napkins arranged with a precision Linda usually reserved for holidays. Rachel stood near the kitchen island, arms crossed, not looking at me. Linda was at the stove stirring something that didn't need stirring. Mitchell sat at the head of the table already, which was unusual. He was never the first one seated. Nobody said hello. Nobody hugged me. I set my purse down slowly, watching the room, watching the way Ethan hesitated in the doorway before coming to stand beside me instead of running off to find his cousins the way he normally did. Even an 8-year-old could feel it. The air had a texture to it, something heavy and rehearsed, like everyone in that room had already agreed on something without me. We sat down to eat, and for the first few minutes nobody spoke. Forks against plates, the hum of the refrigerator. Rachel's eyes kept flicking toward Mitchell like she was waiting for a cue. Then he set down his fork. Joanna, he said, and his voice had that same flatness from the phone call. It's time to tell the truth. The room went still. I looked at him, genuinely confused, my mind racing through every possible thing he could mean. A financial problem, a mistake at his company, something about his health. I had no idea, none, that in the next few minutes I would be sitting at that table listening to my family put me on trial for a truth I didn't even know I was supposed to be hiding. I need to tell you about the 17 years before that dinner, because you can't understand how deep a betrayal cuts, unless you understand how much trust was there to break. Mitchell and I met at a wedding when I was 24, still new to nursing, still living on ramen and overtime pay. He made me laugh so hard at the reception that I spilled wine on a bridesmaid's dress, and somehow that became the story we told at every anniversary dinner for the next 2 decades. We married 18 months later in a small ceremony behind his mother's church. And I remember standing at the altar thinking I had found the one steady thing in a life that had never had much steadiness in it. For the first several years, things were good, simple but good. Mitchell worked construction crews before he saved enough to start his own company. I worked my way up from a floor nurse to a charge position, picking up extra shifts whenever the department needed coverage. When Ethan was born, something in both of us shifted, softened, I think, in the way it does when you suddenly understand what you're protecting. But marriages aren't just made of good years. They're made of the hard ones too, and we had our share. Mitchell's company nearly folded twice. The first time was when Ethan was 2. A partner walked out with half their equipment and most of their client list, and Mitchell spent 8 months rebuilding from almost nothing. The second time came 4 years later when a large contract fell through right after he'd hired 3 new crew members. Both times I picked up the slack. I took every extra shift the hospital would give me. I stopped buying anything that wasn't necessary. I told him more than once that we were a team, that this was what a team did. One person carries more when the other person can't. I never resented it. I want to be honest about that because what happened later might make you think I was owed some kind of payback, some secret bitterness I'd been storing away. I wasn't. I loved him. I loved the life we were building even when it wobbled. What I didn't fully understand, what I only started to piece together after that dinner, was how much his mother's voice had been living in the back of his mind the entire time. Linda never liked me, not really. She was polite in the way people are polite when they've decided not to make a scene. But I always felt her watching me, cataloguing things, how I dressed, how I spoke to Mitchell, how much time I spent at the hospital instead of at her son's side. She had opinions about the woman her son should have married, and I don't think I ever fully matched that picture, no matter how many years I gave to this family. Rachel, Mitchell's younger sister, had her own complicated feelings toward me. She and Mitchell were close, closer than most siblings, always finishing each other's sentences, always taking each other's side in old family arguments. I think somewhere along the way she started to see my closeness with Mitchell as something taken from her rather than something separate. She was never outright cruel, but there was always an edge to her, a way of bringing up old stories that made me look selfish or distracted, usually at family gatherings where I had no chance to explain myself. I didn't think much of it. Most days, families are complicated. I told myself that as long as Mitchell and I were solid, none of it mattered. That afternoon, driving to Linda's house with Ethan in the back seat, asking about his multiplication homework, I had no idea that solid ground was already gone. By the time we sat down at that table, Mitchell wasn't looking at me as his wife of 17 years. He was looking at me as a woman on trial. I didn't know any of this yet. As I took my seat that evening, I only knew that something was wrong, that the air in that dining room felt like the moment before a storm breaks, and that my son was watching all of us with the wide, uncertain eyes of a child who senses danger before he can name it. Mitchell cleared his throat. "Joanna," he said again, quieter this time, "we need to talk about Ethan." And that's when the family trial truly began. Rachel spoke first, and I understood immediately that whatever was about to happen had been planned in advance, rehearsed, maybe discussed in some conversation I was never invited to. "Do you remember your trip to Seattle?" she asked, not looking at me directly, addressing the question to the table as if I weren't sitting right there. 2 years ago, that conference. I remembered it perfectly. A 3-day nursing symposium, hotel receipts, a roommate named Deborah from the cardiac unit who snored so loudly I'd barely slept. I told her as much, my voice steady even as my pulse had started to climb. "And all those night shifts," Rachel continued, as if I hadn't spoken at all. "Every week, sometimes back to back. Nobody really knows where you are during those hours, do they?" "I'm at the hospital, Rachel. I have badge scans, time cards, co-workers who could vouch for every hour of every shift I've worked in that building for the last 12 years. I heard my own voice, and it surprised me how calm it sounded, even as something inside my chest had begun to crack. Linda set down her water glass with a click that felt deliberate. "Women always leave clues, Joanna, whether they mean to or not." I looked at her, this woman who had sat across from me at 100 dinners, who had held Ethan as a newborn in the hospital, who had once told me years ago in a rare, unguarded moment that she was glad Mitchell had found someone steady. That woman was gone. In her place was someone looking at me like evidence in a case already decided. "What clues," I said quietly, "are you talking about?" Nobody answered directly. Instead, Mitchell finally spoke, and his voice had a tremor in it that I hadn't heard since his father's funeral 12 years earlier. "I've had doubts," he said. "For months now, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The colouring, the bone structure, things people said." He glanced at his mother, then at Rachel, gathering some kind of courage from their faces before he could look at mine. "So I did something. I need you to know I did something." My stomach dropped before he even said the words. "I took some of Ethan's hair from his hairbrush. I sent it in for a paternity test." The room went silent in a way that felt physical, like the air itself had been pulled tight. I stared at him, waiting for him to tell me he was joking, that this was some kind of terrible misunderstanding, that any second now he would laugh and say he could never actually do something like that behind my back. But his face didn't change. He reached into his jacket pocket and set an envelope on the table. "I got the results back this morning," he said. I looked at that envelope sitting on the white tablecloth, and I felt something in me go very still, very quiet. The way I imagine a person feels in the seconds after an accident before the pain has fully arrived. 17 years, I said. My voice didn't rise, I didn't cry. Some clinical part of my brain, the part trained to stay calm during codes and emergencies, took over and held everything else together. 17 years, Mitchell, and you never once asked me. You went behind my back. You took our son's hair without telling me. You let your mother and your sister sit here and build a case against me instead of picking up the phone and asking your wife a single honest question. He didn't answer. He couldn't meet my eyes. I turned to Ethan, who had gone very quiet beside me, his small hands gripping the edge of the table, his eyes darting between the adults like he was trying to solve a puzzle that terrified him. I reached over and pulled him against my side, and I felt him trembling. "It's okay, baby," I whispered, though nothing about that moment was okay. Linda's voice cut through the quiet. "We'll take care of the boy, Joanna. Whatever happens here, Ethan is still a Franklin. He belongs with this family." Something in me that had been bending for the last several minutes finally straightened. "You will never take my son," I said, and for the first time since I'd walked through that door, my voice carried an edge sharp enough to make Linda blink. "Not you, not Rachel, not even Mitchell. Not like this. Not with an envelope and a rehearsed speech and a table set for everyone except me." That's when the doorbell rang. I hadn't even registered the first ring. I realized now it must have sounded sometime during Mitchell's confession, swallowed by the roaring in my own ears. But this second ring was unmistakable, clear and insistent, cutting straight through the tension in that dining room. Nobody moved. Mitchell glanced toward the hallway, then back at the envelope on the table, as if the doorbell were a smaller problem than the one currently unfolding in front of him. Rachel stared at her lap. Linda's eyes flicked toward the window, toward the porch light glowing faintly through the curtains. But she made no move to rise either. I sat there with Ethan pressed against my side, his small heartbeat fast against my arm, and for a moment the five of us existed in a strange, suspended silence. The envelope on the table, the untouched food going cold, and someone standing on the porch outside, waiting while none of us could bring ourselves to answer. The bell rang a third time, longer now, more insistent, and finally Mitchell pushed his chair back with a scrape that seemed too loud for the silence we'd all been sitting in. He walked toward the front hallway like a man moving through water, slow and reluctant, as if some part of him already sensed that whoever stood on the other side of that door was about to change everything. I stayed where I was, one arm still around Ethan, my eyes fixed on the envelope lying on the tablecloth. I hadn't touched it. I don't think I could have, not yet. Some part of me was still waiting for someone to tell me this was a mistake, a nightmare I would wake from in my own bed with Mitchell breathing quietly beside me. I heard the front door open, a pause, then Mitchell's voice, confused, "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for the Franklin family." A man's voice answered, low and steady, with the particular calm of someone used to delivering serious news. "I'm sorry to come so late, this couldn't wait." I knew that voice before I even saw his face. Dr. Samuel Carter stepped into the doorway behind Mitchell a moment later, and something in my chest lurched. Not fear this time, but a strange, disorienting flicker of recognition, like running into a face from a dream in the middle of ordinary life. He looked older than I remembered, more grey in his hair, deeper lines around his eyes, but I would have known him anywhere. He had been the obstetrician who delivered Ethan 8 years earlier, the man whose steady hands had guided my son into the world during a labour that had gone on for 19 exhausting hours. "Dr. Carter," I said, rising halfway out of my chair. He looked past Mitchell and found me immediately, and something in his expression eased with relief, like he'd been afraid he might be too late for whatever he'd come to say. "Joanna, thank God." He held a thin folder against his chest, the edges worn soft from handling. "I need to speak with your family, all of you. I know this is an unusual time to show up, but I promise you it couldn't wait until morning." Dr. Carter explained that 8 years ago, Springfield Memorial's maternity lab had experienced a processing error affecting a batch of postnatal samples. The error had been corrected in most active files, but a subset of older archive samples had never been flagged for correction. When Mitchell submitted Ethan's hair sample to the private lab, the lab had cross-referenced it against archived hospital birth records. The archived sample they pulled was one of the affected ones. It didn't belong to Ethan at all. It belonged to another child born that same week. "The test you got back this morning," Dr. Carter said, looking at Mitchell, "wasn't comparing your DNA to Ethan's. It was comparing your sample against a mislabeled archival record. The 0% probability of paternity you received reflects an error in our system, not a truth about your family." He reached into the folder and laid out several documents on the table. The original hospital intake records from Ethan's birth, complete with timestamped documentation, followed by a fresh laboratory report dated that very afternoon, showing a new test performed using a freshly collected sample from Mitchell, and a freshly collected sample from Ethan drawn under Dr. Carter's direct supervision that evening before he'd driven over. "I wanted absolute certainty before I said another word to this family," he explained. "I couldn't in good conscience let you sit with a false result for even one more night, knowing what kind of damage that could do." He turned the final page toward Mitchell. "Probability of paternity, 99.99%. The number sat there on the page, stark and undeniable, and I watched every person at that table absorb it differently. Mitchell's hands began to shake as he stared down at the paper, his mouth opening and closing without sound like a man trying to speak underwater. Rachel had gone pale, her earlier certainty visibly crumbling. Linda's hand had risen to cover her mouth, her eyes wide, her earlier coldness replaced by something that looked for the first time all evening like fear. I didn't move. I sat very still, Ethan's small body warm against my side, and I looked at that number 99% and felt no relief. Not yet. What I felt instead was a strange hollow clarity, the kind that comes after an adrenaline surge has passed and left you standing in the wreckage of what it caused. Mitchell looked up from the report, his eyes wet, searching my face for something. Relief, maybe forgiveness. I couldn't give him either in that moment. "Joanna," he started. I held up a hand, not sharply but firmly enough that he stopped. "You believed a piece of paper," I said quietly, "before you believed your wife." The words landed heavier than I expected them to, heavier than anything Rachel or Linda had said all evening. Because they were true and everyone at that table knew it. Mitchell's face crumpled in a way I had never seen in 17 years of marriage. Not at his father's funeral, not during the worst of his company's financial collapse, not ever. He looked like a man watching the full weight of his mistake settle onto his shoulders for the first time. Dr. Carter, perhaps sensing that his presence was no longer necessary for what came next, gathered the remaining papers gently and set the folder down in front of me instead of Mitchell. "I'll leave this with you," he said softly. "You should have your own copies. I'm deeply sorry this happened to your family." I thanked him, my voice steadier than I felt, and he let himself out quietly, the front door clicking shut behind him with a softness that felt almost respectful, like he understood the room needed space to absorb what remained. For a long moment after he left, nobody said anything at all. Ethan finally broke the silence, tugging gently on my sleeve. "Mom," he whispered, "does that mean Dad's still my dad?" I looked down at my son's face, so full of confusion and quiet hope, and something in my chest ached with a tenderness that cut sharper than any anger I still carried. "Yes, baby," I said softly, "he always was." Across the table, Mitchell put his face in his hands, and for the first time that night I heard him cry. We didn't go back to what we were before that night. I don't think we could have, and honestly I'm not sure I would have wanted to. What we built instead was something more honest, if slower and harder, a marriage where doubt gets spoken aloud instead of buried, where Mitchell no longer lets his mother's voice drown out mine. Where Rachel and I are still finding our way toward something resembling trust, one small gesture at a time. Mitchell started therapy. He started setting boundaries with Linda, something I had never once seen him do in all our years together. When she called, demanding he come over for an unplanned dinner, I heard him say the word no to her for what might have been the first time in his adult life. His voice was shaking slightly, but firm. Rachel's apology, when it finally came, arrived by way of a handwritten letter rather than a conversation. She admitted in careful, uncomfortable language that some of what she'd said that night had come from old jealousy she'd never fully dealt with. Resentment about how close Mitchell and I had always been, and fear that she'd somehow lost her place in the family because of it. I didn't respond right away. Some wounds need more than a letter to heal, but I appreciated that she'd tried to name the truth instead of hiding behind the lab's mistake. Mitchell and I began marriage counselling together in early spring, driving to a small office across town every Thursday evening, sitting in uncomfortable chairs across from a consultant who asked us questions neither of us particularly wanted to answer. We talked about the doubt he'd carried in silence for months. We talked about the years I had spent absorbing extra shifts and financial stress without ever asking him to share the weight more evenly. We talked about how easy it had become somewhere along the way for both of us to manage problems quietly instead of voicing them honestly, until quiet became its own kind of danger. It wasn't easy. There were sessions where I left hungrier than when I'd arrived, replaying his mother's words at that dinner table, feeling the sting of them fresh all over again. There were nights Mitchell and I sat in the same room without speaking, both of us unsure how to close the distance that had opened between us. But slowly, week by week, something began to shift. I think about that night often, the envelope on the table, the doorbell ringing while no one moved, the terrifying certainty on every face around me. And I've come to understand something I don't think I ever fully grasped before it happened to me. People think DNA proves who belongs in a family. They're wrong. DNA can prove biology. But trust, the kind that holds a marriage together, the kind that makes a house feel safe for a frightened 8-year-old under a dinner table, that's something we choose every single day. Not once, not with a single grand gesture, but over and over in 1,000 small decisions to believe the people we love instead of the doubts whispered in our ear.